I think you guys have watched me enough in this video. Now go watch all my other videos. And hit like and subscribe and comment and all the other stuff that all the famous YouTubers say. Do all that stuff. Please? Thank you. Thanks. Hey viewers, today's vehicle is a 2013 Ford Flex. It has a noisy driver's side rear wheel bearing, and the brakes are pretty well shot in the rear. So we're going to throw a wheel bearing in it and replace the brakes. Holding the rotor on, there's a little screw right here. It's got a T40 head on it. So in order to get the rotor off, you got to pull that off. Now if you're doing this job just to replace the wheel bearing, you don't have to take the caliper off the caliper bracket. You can leave these alone. And there's two 15mm bolts, one right here and one right up there. And that'll remove the whole caliper bracket as an assembly. However, we're going to be putting brakes on this, so I'm going to take the caliper off the bracket, and then I'll take the bracket off there by removing those two 15mm. These are 13mm. I'm going to remove these two 13mm bolts that are holding the caliper to the caliper bracket. And then, everybody's got one of these in their garage. Pull this off of one of your rubber bungee cords. They work great for hanging calipers up out of the way so that they're not hanging by the hose. Okay, I'm going to pull the two 15mm bracket bolts out of here. There's quite a bit of rust holding this rotor on. You can usually pop these loose by giving them a little tappy tap. From the back side, if you can. If you can't, you can hit them right along here to usually break them loose. Okay, on the Ford Flex, when you call a parts store and you tell them you're looking for rear rotors and pads, they're going to ask you, does that have heavy-duty brakes? How would you know? I mean, who would expect a Ford Flex to have heavy-duty brakes? Here's how you know. If your rotor is vented like this, this is heavy-duty brakes. If this rotor was thinner and one solid strip of metal, one solid strip of steel, those are standard brakes. So just remember, if your rear rotor is vented, that's heavy-duty brakes. So before we go behind it and pull out those bolts and start to push this bearing out, we have to take this axle nut off and make sure that the axle shaft slides that way. Because we don't want the axle shaft to slide this way as we're removing the bearing, because it'll break the speed sensor off. So always, always, always do this on this style. I believe, yeah, it's a 32mm nut. As you can see, ours is loose, so we're good. If it's not loose, you can put an air hammer with a pointed bit on there, or you can leave the nut on and you can tap on it that way. But you want to make sure that's loose and it moves that way, because if it, like I said, if it pulls this way, it'll break that. So the three that you can see right now, this one, that one, and that one, are fairly easy to get from underneath here. The one that's way back over on that side, it's kind of hard to get at, so we'll use a wrench when we get to that one. These are 18mm. I'm screwing it back in a few turns. I'll show you why in a bit. Okay, in order to remove the bearing, I'm going to strike these. I'm going to use my air hammer, but you could use a hammer actually if you could get enough swing in here. But I'm going to use my air hammer to hit these, and it'll actually push the bearing out. We'll go over here and we'll get that one out with a wrench now. Okay, now we can pull the last bolt out, which is right here. I'm going to take this bolt all the way out because there's no way I could hit on it anyways with the shock in the way. Oh, you know what? We're out of air. I shut the compressor off earlier. So this one's not cooperating. I went ahead and removed all the bolts, and I'm going to try striking this with a hammer, and then I'm going to try to run my air hammer against the ears of the hub assembly. The issue is it's dissimilar metals. The steering knuckle, or the knuckle, is made out of cast aluminum, and then of course we've got steel for a wheel bearing, and it just oxidizes and locks itself in there like Loctite. Better than Loctite. Okay, so since this bearing doesn't want to come out, I'm going to have to use a little bit of heat to try to heat it up and persuade it to come out. But you can't heat them up if you don't remove this wheel speed sensor because you'll damage it. So that just pops out of there, and there's a 8mm bolt holding that in. You won't have to do this on most wheel bearings. This is, I'd say maybe 50% of them, they get stuck like this. Okay, that's just a plastic sensor in there, so you want to be real careful. You don't want to pry it up with a screwdriver. I find that if you can get a pair of vice grips in here, needle nose ones, to grab it, you can usually wiggle them. Real carefully without breaking it. Get it to turn a little bit, and then just kind of upward pressure, and boom, she's out. And that is your wheel speed sensor right there. All constructed with plastic. Well, not all. A little bit of metal inside, but you want to be real careful when you pull those out. So we'll set that out of the way, and now I can heat this hub up and try to get it out of here. Okay, here's our Napa high quality wheel bearing. You'll notice that the bolts aren't symmetric, so you can only put it in one way. Okay. Before you saw me clean all this out. Before I put it in, I'm going to put a thin layer of anti-seize around here, so the next time I have to change this bearing, if I do, it'll come out easier, or for whoever changes it next. Okay, I put the anti-seize around there. You want to be careful when you put anti-seize on here. You don't want to cover the whole thing because this is the actual tone wheel. The tone ring, I'm sorry, is right inside of here, and that wheel speed sensor reads against it. So you don't want to smother this with anti-seize because obviously that would grab dirt and crud and everything else. Let's see here. You saw how hard I had to beat the old one to get it out, and after I cleaned that out, look at this. The new one fits right in there. I mean, nothing to it. It was all corrosion holding that in. Alright, we'll go ahead and reinstall our speed sensor. It's a good idea just to make sure that there's not a bunch of crud built up on this. But you don't want to put anti-seize or anything up here because a lot of the anti-seize will cause you more problems. On the end of the speed sensor. So you don't want to put anti-seize on here. We're going to put this back in here. And we will take our wire here and stick it right back in this little bracket. There we go. Alright. The wheel bearing came with a new nut. And you can see the new nut has its own Loctite in there. Okay, the wheel bearing's done. Let's move on to the brakes. Okay, this kind of caliper requires you to turn this piston clockwise as it goes into the bore. It's not like you can't just push against this kind. So there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, but I've got this $25 tool from Harbor Freight that I've been using for about 15 years. It works great. So we're going to put this adapter on the end of it, which makes these pegs wider, and these pegs will sit right in these slots. Okay? And then as you can see, this moves like right here, and then we'll use a wrench. We'll back this out to apply pressure, and we'll twist it as it goes in. I'll get it set up here, and I'll get my hands out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. Okay. So now the tool is against the piston. Now we'll just back this out. I'm going to move the camera so you guys can see what I'm doing here. So as I twist that, I turn this counterclockwise, which forces that piston in. We'll twist it as far as it'll twist, and then we'll turn this a little bit more. We'll go a little bit more. I think we're about there. We'll try that. I'll put the rest of the brakes together, and if it needs to go another turn, we'll do it another turn. Were you about to comment to tell me the rotor was on backwards? I always hang the rotor on backwards to clean it off like that. And back in the dealership days, people were always quick to point out that I had the rotor on backwards. You don't say. Little preference of mine, every time I put brakes on, I always try to replace the, get you back in the frame here, the slides. You buy the premium pads and they always come with them. So it's important to clean all the rust out of here so the new ones fit in there right. Another thing I like to do is take these pins out, clean them up and grease them, even if they're smooth. Like, see how good that moves? It doesn't feel like there's anything wrong with it, but over time they lose grease. So it certainly doesn't hurt to take them out and inspect them, dip them in my grease thing and plug them back in, and that's exactly what I do every time I do brakes. It just helps. Even if the customer doesn't know it, it helps. I see so many mechanics that work on vehicles that skip those steps. It literally takes a minute to do, and it'll make your brakes last longer. That's probably why they don't do it. They don't want the brakes to last longer. Let's see here. This is going to go right here. You'll see there's two kinds of clips in here. There's some that are like, let's see here. Okay, there's some that are like this with the tab on the right side as you look at it from this angle, and there's some with the tab on the left side. This little tab that sticks out always goes to the outside. If you put it on there on the inside, it would rub on the rotor. So that little extra piece right there, that always goes on the outside. Just putting a light layer of grease in there. If your brake pads only have these wear indicators on two of the pads, those always go on the inside. The reason for that is the inside pads, the inboard pad's the first one to wear out. When you do a brake job, it's really important that the pad fit in there nice and it's able to move back and forth, because if it's not, it'll hang up and it'll squeak and the customer will come back all mad at you with the Sensia disease. Ever since you did my brakes. Alright. So that's how you do a wheel bearing in a 2013 Ford Flex rear wheel bearing and rotors and pads. I still got to do the other side, but I think you guys have watched me enough in this video. Now go watch all my other videos and hit like and subscribe and comment and all the other stuff that all the famous YouTubers say. Do all that stuff, please. Thank you. Thanks.